Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. This is the NetConf working group. And let me pull up the slides.
Hi, Mahesh. This is Captain. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right. Right, so I am.
See your slides.
Okay. Do you see the slides?
Looking good.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or very late night for some folks in North America. This is the NetConf working group meeting for 109. This is a note. By participating in this, you agree to follow all the IETF procedures and policies. If you are aware of any IETF contributions that are covered by patents or patent applications that are under control, you must disclose that fact. Of course, you agree to abide by any IETF rules, regulations as that pertain to an attendee. More information can be found in any of these links that you find on this page. Just a quick recap on the administrative trivia. Kent and I will be trying to monitor the Meet Echo chat window for comments. But if you want to present or have one of us speak into the mic for you, make sure you preface the comment with mic in the front so we know that one of us needs to take it to the mic. The hum window, which is the one that you'll use for polling, will be is right next to the chat tab on the left side. No need to do any virtual blue sheet signing. Meet Echo will record your presence. When you need to queue up to ask any questions, make sure you click on the raise hand icon, and we will then call you and put you on the queue to speak. Make sure you unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon with the play symbol. All right. Jabber, we'll talk about it on the next slide. We do encourage minute takers, as many as we can, to take the minutes. You will find the link for the Cody Minute Taker tab on the top side of your screen. Right. For Jabber, I have this link to use if you want to set up Jabber. And don't ask me too many details. Whatever information is there probably is what I use to set up Jabber. But also note that Meet Echo chat window will cross-post, or they will cross-post to each other. So if you are on Jabber, we will see it on the Meet Echo chat window. Logs, of course, for the meeting will be available after the meeting. Right. Status of the chartered workgroup items. Yang push notifications when past second last call. This has been called the second time. We are still waiting for a pending authors update. We hope we can get the authors to come back and finish the document. The crypto types, trust anchor, and key store documents are in working group last call. I guess Kent will give an update, something about sector review and author responses. I'll let him speak to it when he gives the status update. The client server suite of drafts will go into working group last call once the security drafts listed above clear last call. We don't want to inundate the working group with more documents till we have cleared what's on the deck. HTTPS notification is nearing working group last call. We'll talk about it when I present that draft. Yang push notification messages again is waiting on HTTPS notif draft. We'll resurrect it once we're ready to send HTTPS notification to last call. The remaining documents are all work in progress. So, and we'll hear about them in this meeting. So here's the agenda.
I'm sorry, before moving on, I see our AD is in the queue. So,
all right.
I'm sorry, I just removed. I'm sorry, Robert. I just removed you from the queue? Can you go back in?
Yeah, that's fine. Is my audio coming through?
Yes.
So just a quick question on the meeting notes. I went to CodeMD, but it gives me a blank new page. It looks like the fact that I've created it. So I can add some meeting notes to that, but it doesn't have the normal structure that you would expect. Maybe that'll need some sorting out afterwards, unless you know.
So that actually may be the case. I did not initialize it with any content. Did you, Mahesh?
No, I didn't. Maybe Rob, I can, when Ken starts speaking, I can cut and paste the agenda into the.
Okay, then I'll wait before I make any notes until you do that.
Well, okay. I just pasted the agenda into the.
Okay, that's great. Thanks.
Right. So here's the agenda for the meeting. Kent will walk through the status and issues with all the client server suite of drafts, including also the security set of drafts. And in order to minimize exchanging too many screens, Ken will continue with the CSR bootstrapping SZTP draft, and then I'll take over, followed by Pierre and Thomas. The non-chartered items, we have Peng Liu and Chin coming back with the drafts they had presented before. And then we have one new draft from Jan Lindblad, followed by Kent and Chin talking about a list pagination mechanism. There is no draft currently posted. I guess they will give us an update on that. Right? Any questions? Any agenda bashing? Anything else we want to see? All right, with that, I'll stop sharing and bring up the next suite of draft. Sure.
Yeah, I can see it.
Are you able to see?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is the update. Oh no, I'm getting an echo. This is the update to the client server suite of drafts. Since IETF 108, just a few small high-level updates. In crypto types, we added the password grouping to define a union between a clear text password and an encrypted password. And then you'll see that grouping is now being used in, I think, 3 of the other drafts. And we also added feature statements for the encrypted formats, specifically password encryption, symmetric key encryption, and private key encryption. Those are all now, those are the names of the features. I'm sorry, Mahesh, you just dropped out of full screen. I'm not sure if you did that on purpose. It's okay. those are the names of the features, and of course they're controlling whether or not the server supports the encrypting of passwords, symmetric keys, and private keys, respectively. And also a certificate expiration notification. We added a feature for that, for controlling whether or not the server supports sending notifications when certificates are expiring. In trust anchors, and actually really for the remaining, well, you'll see what the primary thing was, is that there was a sector review by Sandy Murphy on the key store draft, but that review had comments that were applicable to all the drafts. I guess you might even say to some degree they were editorial, and so the changing and improving the way the content was being presented was reflected in all of the drafts. So that's essentially the change that was made in trust anchors and in all the others as well. Also in the key store draft, there's section 4, which is entitled Encrypting Keys for Configuration, was pretty much entirely rewritten to present things in a manner that was more acceptable to sector. Okay, next slide, please. Moving on, we have in Tcp Client Server. So here was the case in the SOX GSA API. We modified it. There was a field for a password, so we modified it to use the password grouping. And now it's the case that the password may be in clear text or encrypted there in that configuration data model. We also added, there was missing mandatory true in that particular node when you selected whether or not it was going to be a kind of SOX, a password-based SOX. It didn't have it, that the username and password were actually mandatory leaves, so that got added. I forget who mentioned it, but there was a missing registration for the TCP common module, so we added that in the IANA consideration section. Similarly, in the SSH client server draft, there was the modification to in the client, the SSH client, when you're configuring for password-based authentication. That password was previously only, it could previously only be clear text, and now it's using the password grouping, so either a clear text or encrypted password can be configured. In TLS client server, both the client authentication and server authentication for PSKs, it's got converted from being a presence container to a leaf of type empty. There was a number of fixed needs that got cleaned up, and yeah, that was the main update. Okay, in the HTTP client server draft, there was also some fixed needs that got removed in the HTTP client. When you're using basic authentication, there's a password. It was previously just clear text. Now it's using password grouping, so it can be encrypted. And strangely, oh, okay, I see it now. Hovering over the screen, it blocks the text of what's being presented. In the both the NetConf and client and RESTConf client server drafts, the same sector review comments were reflected there. Next slide, please. So I don't normally spend a lot of time on the changes that were made since the last IETF meeting, because there's usually a lot more to talk about, but in this case there isn't. There was just the sector review from Sandy, and then Yav Nir submitted a sector review for the trust store draft, which I've yet to work through, though the changes, the comments that were made there were fairly high level and didn't appear that they would have any significant impact to the drafts. In general, we've been waiting, and I'm putting on my chair hat for a moment, Mahesh and I have been waiting for these first 3 drafts to stabilized from a sector perspective and also from a Yang doctor perspective. I think there's a Yang doctor review outstanding for these drafts, so we're hoping to get that those updates sort of completed for these first three core drafts, and then whatever cascading changes would occur, such as the ones you saw already, the Sandy sector review had cascading impact to all the other drafts. So any other cascading impacts would be completed, at which time all the remaining drafts would be ready for last call. Actually, in my view, they're already ready for last call, sans any potential cascading changes that would need to be made to them as per the outstanding sector and Yang doctor reviews. And that might be it. Next slide. I think that is it. Yeah, that is it. Are there any questions?
Right. If there are none, can we move to the next one?
Absolutely.
All right. So Kent, what I'm finding is that Windows gets taken over completely if I go into full screen.
I don't think you need to go to full screen.
Okay, let me try to see if I can share it without going full screen and see if it. So that's what it looks like.
Right. And that does not look good. It was better before when it was.
Okay.
See, do you have an ability to do play in window as opposed to full screen? Play in full screen versus play in window?
No, I don't.
Okay. I think the full screen then is better. Do you want to go full screen?
Okay, do you see?
Yeah, I see it. It looks good. Thank you. This presentation regards an update. Of course, we just adopted this draft in, well, actually, it was one of the, remember we did, the chairs, the NetConf chairs did a adoption suitability, a number of email threads, one, I think for 9 drafts that were potentially queued up for adoption, and this was one of the drafts that went through that, and it was adopted. And so immediately I posted the 00, which was identical to the 01 from before, the KWATs and the ID, and that's really up until Monday, just a couple days ago. That was the officially published version. But then I did a grep for the word "fix me" in TBD, and I noticed that I had actually left an editorial note. Sorry, next slide, please. I noticed an editorial note and found myself needing to make a quick fix to that, and that's why I posted a 01 in that it was in the security consideration section. And so the update that you saw posted on Monday was just for that 01 update. Sorry for that to fix that editorial comment that I had left in the securities consideration section. Next slide, please. Okay, so when this draft was presented last time, we had said that the authors had made every effort for the draft to basically be ready for last call. It was already ready for last call. We had taken the time and effort to do everything, including the security considerations and IANA considerations and everything. We thought we were done and ready, but then one of the authors had an exchange with another IETF contributor from a different company, not someone who's commonly in the NetConf working group, regarding CRMF, which is a Microsoft format, stands for Certificate Request Message Format. Actually, it's not technically a Microsoft format anymore. It's an IETF format, but it was originally supported by Microsoft. And they wanted to ensure that CRMF was being supported. And so we thought that we were going to need to do an update for that. But to the second bullet point, it turns out that the draft already supporting CSRs with the CRMFs. And in particular, the draft supports CSRs in 3 formats. The first being your standard P10 format, PKCS number 10 format, and then also CMP and CMC. And both CMP and CMC themselves support both P10 and CRMF, and hence already the draft supports CRMFs vis-a-vis its support for CMP and CMC. So with that resolved, in essence, there was no update to the draft. It turns out, other than that editorial nit that I mentioned on the previous slide, the draft was in fact complete and done and ready for last call previously. However, to bullet point number 3, the same comment from that IETF contributor in a different working group spun off a number of some other drafts. So you'll notice in the LAMPS working group, a couple drafts by Russ Housley on updating CRMF algorithms, and yet another one for updating AES GMAC algorithm. So these other drafts that are not NetConf specific sort of complete the response that was being made by the other IETF contributor, and so it's out of scope to this draft. Next slide, please. And so beyond that, there is in fact no remaining update to be made. If there's any comments or questions or concerns regarding this work, please mention now. If not, then I believe this draft is ready, or I should say the authors believe this draft is ready for working group last call. I see a comment in the chat window from Rich congratulating for the update. Thank you. I think we're done then. And so I think here, Mahesh is where I'm going to take over being slide presenter. Okay.
All right, so I will talk about updates to the HTTPS based transport for subscribe notifications draft. There were 2 updates. One, just a quick editorial, not an editorial, but a quick update, which I'll talk about in 06 that I'll talk about on the slides. Next slide, please. All right, so updates since 04, really there are only 2 main changes. The last update to 06 really updated the security considerations section to bring it into compliance with RFC 8407. And the second change is regarding examples for receiving of event notifications. Next slide, please. So I think there were comments received in the last IETF meeting that maybe the draft could do well with an example for receiving of event notifications. There was an example for JSON. We did add another example for XML, the corresponding example actually for XML in the draft. So with those two examples and the fact that we have completed the security considerations section, let's go to actually, I don't know if there's another slide. Yeah, so with those two changes, we believe that this document is also ready for working group last call. But rather than us, the chair is calling for it, we'll both step down and see if Rob might take over at this point and see if he wants to do a poll or not.
Yes, hopefully my audio is coming through. So I think the first question is anyone, does anyone have any comments or questions on this before I do a poll to see if people are happy for me to check for working group last call? So otherwise, then I don't see any comments in the queue. Can one of you Kent or Mahesh, do a poll, run a poll just to check? So the question is, are other people happy for this to go to working group last call?
All right, so please.
So just so people where they know, there's tabs on the left. It's just under the hand icon. Looks like three little bars, and you can either click to raise your hand or do not raise your hand, or choose to do nothing.
I think I started the poll, but I have a typo. So is it started?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. It says WGLS instead of WGLSC, sorry. But anyway.
So we've got 10 people that say they're happy if this goes to working group last call. There's no one that's chosen not to raise their hand out of 34 participants. So it's 11. I think that's fine. So I think we can, yeah, it's going up slightly. So I think we can take this to kick off the working group last call. I will work with Kent and Mahesh to work out exactly what the process should be in this particular case. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. So Kent, are you going with the next deck? How do?
Yes, I was just saying if Pierre could come to the queue to I'll bring up the presentation right now. It does take a little bit of effort to switch presentations, so that's why there's a delay. You have to load it and then ask to share the application window.
So Pierre, yeah, I guess you don't need to share your screen, so I'm going to cancel, but you can
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. And now I have it loaded. I'm just about to share the application window. Okay, should look good.
Yep. Thanks, Mahesh. So I'm Pierre from INSA Lyon, and I'm going to present an update on the UDP notif draft, joint work with Guan Ying and Tianran from Huawei. Thomas from Swisscom and Paolo from NTT, and a bunch of developers who worked on this, notably last week during the hackathon. So next slide, please, Mahesh. So I'll make a quick reminder of the goal of the draft, then I'll show the main difference with the -00, trying to cover the most important comments that we received on the mailing list since then. Then the main point is to shut my mic and let you guys discuss and take notes on this. So next slide, please. So the main use case presented on this draft is to allow for routers with distributed architectures to publish massive amounts of networking data, mostly traffic volume information. The point is to have line cards directly send out the data towards the collector. And for this, we had a requirement to have a low performance impact, hence the use of lightweight UDP-based protocol. This draft is to be used with the draft that Thomas is going to give an update on later, which is the subscription to distributed notifications. Next slide, please, Mahesh. So first set of changes based on the comments we received in the last month. We renamed, for obvious reason, the fragmentation option into segmentation option, because that's basically what we do. In order to be consistent with the netconf distributed notif draft, I changed the generator ID term into observation domain ID. Then we reworked the applicability section part of the draft to align with the RFC 8085 on UDP usage guidelines. Mostly what we covered is congestion control or lack thereof, dealing with MTU, and the lack of reliability of the draft. Basically, what we did is to show that the context in which this protocol would be deployed is aligned with the recommendations that are proposed, that are defined in the RFC. So I did not list all the strict recommendation and guidelines of the RFC, but I've been sticking to the actual guidelines for the context of application of this protocol. Next slide, please. Then we proposed some changes to the notification message header. So what you can see first is that we stole a bit from the version field to introduce what we called an encoding space flag. When it is unset, it means that the encoding type field is standard, meaning that the value that is in there is defining an encoding that is standard. And when this flag is set, it means that we are falling into private encoding type space. What we mean by private is, for example, GPB, that is not a standard. And what would go there is any encoding type that a vendor would support that is not a standard, and that the vendor would decide on its own which encoding type it would decide to use. I agree that relying on the vendor documentation to figure out what your favorite vendor is sending to you would feel a bit archaic. So we have been having discussion on whether we would need a netconf to be able to retrieve a description on what the vendor is using as an encoding type. This is open for discussion. Me personally, I don't care too much about non-standard encoding types, so I'm really open to that discussion. Another comment that I received on the header was some people were challenging the need to put the observation domain ID and the message ID in the header itself by making the actually correct comment that those fields could be found in the payload. The main one critical reason to do that is that I would like to not have the big data people that are further downstream the communication channel to have to deal with segmentation. So I would like to be able to reassemble messages that have been segmented before passing them further down the line towards big data. And so in order to do that, as the segmentation option is defined within the scope of a given message received by a given generator, I need those two fields in order to do a consistent job there. So that's the main reason. Another reason is quality of life. When I have those fields up there, I can easily do load balancing based on and by preserving consistency on the generator that is being done. So I can do load balancing based on the generator, and that eases distributed uses of the collector. I received another comment on the fact that we currently use version 0. And that we should use version 1 so that we make sure that the vendor is actually, the producer of those messages is actually setting that field. I'm fine with that. For me, it does not change much, to be honest. If you don't mind, I would like to keep it to 0 until the header has converged to a stable state. So I would suggest that we do that on the version of the draft just before working group last call. If you have strong opinion on that, I'm okay to change it, no problem. There was quite a bit of discussion on how to deal with this private space. So I already said that we can either rely on vendor documentation or write a netconf draft to retrieve that information. I would like you to discuss this, and honestly, we'll follow we'll follow the decision on the working group. I will not fight against any decision that you guys would make on this. Sure, Kent, if you want to go ahead.
This is Kent as a contributor. Regarding the version being 0, I do recommend it. I'd recommend that. In fact, there is a separate RFC. I don't know the number offhand, but there's a IETF recommendation that any enumerated field, both the 0 and the max bit values are reserved values. And so, yes, both 0 as well as, I guess, 7. The value 7 should be reserved fields values for us, if possible.
Okay, so what I will do, I will put it to 1 right away, or else I'm not complying. And for testing purposes, etc., I will use 0 internally, but I will put it to 1 in the draft. Okay, does that work for you?
And I see Mahesh is in the queue. Go ahead, Mahesh.
Right. So, actually, Kent asked one of the questions I was going to ask, or suggest what he suggested. The question on the private spaces, obviously, with the discussion around how you're going to learn of the encoding that is being, is there a negotiation mechanism that you would have then to find out what encoding is being supported, even if it is a vendor specific?
No, what I was trying to say is that if you want, we can define one. Okay, I'm okay to provide a draft, a companion draft to do that. Okay, personally, I don't care really about non-standard encoding, but if that's needed, if we consider here as a working group that basic archaic vendor documentation would not work, then we'll do the work of providing this mechanism. Okay. So if you want to poll the working group on how they want to deal with that, I'm fine with that. Currently, the people I'm interacting with care about the standard ones mostly, right? And so this was the reason why we made this change, was to deal with the fact that GPB is not will be supported by vendors and is not standard, and so it was feeling weird to have it be listed in the draft and given a code point in the standard encoding field. And so that was our way of dealing with that. If you want to change this, I'm also open to this. We had also, for example, a suggestion to not use a space flag, but to reserve the last values of the encoding type field and let vendors use the reserved space. I wanted to make things more clear, you see, and not have to use reserved non-documented bits. And so I did that for clarity reasons. If if you want me to roll this back, I'm fine with this. I just would like to know. Okay.
All right. Thomas, you're next.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I just want to raise that this is a general problem. Do we need to care about private space or not? If yes, then both transport protocols, HTTPS Notif and UDP Notif, should support it. Otherwise, if the working group thinks that this needs not to be supported, then I think it can be removed on this draft.
All right. Andy?
Hi, I would prefer to take that S-bit out and put a GPB back in the standard enumeration. I don't know. I think that's an easier problem to solve than all the complexity being added to discover proprietary encodings and everything.
I agree with you completely. If in 3 months, no one tells me that GPB is not standard and so it should not be there. You see my point? Because otherwise we're going to start walking in circle. You see where I am there? But I agree with you, Andy. I completely agree with you. I'm just scared about what's going to happen in 3 months.
Well, I don't know what, AD reviews and other later reviews are going to produce as objections, but I don't know if there's a problem with how it be referenced or something like that, if it's a documentation problem or not.
Mm-hmm. So
but if that's all it is, then hopefully you just put the enumeration back, and it'll be simpler for people to work with it. Mm-hmm. My original section was just that there was no really reference given document. Not that it shouldn't be there.
Yeah, but if I give a reference, it will have to be an informative one, and so I will give one if we put it back there, but it's going to be informative, and so it's going to be the same comments further down the standardization line, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, I still think the S-bit should be taken out.
I don't mind. I really don't mind. Well, actually, you might be right that if we take it out and use the approach where we reserve some values that would be used for private use, there would not be any reference to non-standard encoding. But then I'm afraid that the question will once again be raised: how does an operator realize in a multi-vendor context and multi-release context which box is sending what? I mean, right, this is the main problem with non-standard stuff. So right, so, and also following the lines of Thomas' comments, I hope we will be consistent with other transport mechanisms that are being used for and that which face the same problem as well.
Okay, Rob?
I would really like to have Robert's opinion on this, actually, as an AD.
Rob, you're next.
I wasn't necessarily going to give an opinion as an AD on this. I think potentially some further discussion. I had a question really as an individual that is just saying GPB sufficient enough in terms of knowing what that encoding actually would be? Because I assumed that with Yang, there's a couple of different ways that you can code this data in Yang. You can either have a generic GPB encoding of Yang data, or in some cases, I thought some people use specific generated GPP models generated from the Yang data. So is there an issue there that the GPP is not the issue about whether the encoding is known or not, but actually what will that data look like? And maybe that could be solved by being more specific about exactly what the encoding is. But I do worry about having something that says it's done in this way, but it's unspecified.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. The good thing is that for this draft, it does not matter, because I would like to answer with not my problem answer, because to me, I'm packing messages that I'm reassembling messages when they are split at the transport layer with this draft, and then I'm passing it down towards the big data people, which know when they register, when they use a distributed subscription to connect to the box, which deal on that side on how they are going to do that. So Thomas, you may want to agree with me or not on this point.
All right.
Yeah. What I just wanted to mention, yeah, and of course I agree here, is maybe another option could be to have in the standard space have a fourth option where we just say other. That might solve the problem as well. Or then, yeah, the question is, and we need, I think, feedback from AD here is if you can have like in this area, like where we just do GPB or we can list any non-standard encoding there. And in the end, it's up to the network operator to figure out how to decode those messages.
All right, Kent.
As a contributor, I just there was a comment made about the HTTPS notif draft. It would also need to support private encoding if this were necessary. And I just wanted to state that I believe that's already the case in two ways. First, if there's using HTTP media types, and it does, define, or I should say, use the standard media types for JSON encoded Yang data and XML encoded Yang data. But of course, it could, private media types could be generated and created and used. And then secondly, for those, for when subscribe notifications are being used and they're being configured, for configured subscribe notifications, there's a Yang identity called encoding, I think. And currently there's sub-identities for JSON and XML, but of course, private or other standard identities, sub-identities could be defined as well. So I think it's already supported there. If to encode private encodings for HTTP, for notifications for HTTPS native.
All right. We should
Okay, I think we may want to have probably offline another round on discussion on this. Yeah, if you don't mind.
So Pierre, why don't you finish your presentation? You have 2 minutes.
Sure, go ahead. Next slide, please.
Okay, I saw Rob and Keith for a second, and Mahesh, we're running ahead of schedule, I think. So
yeah, okay. Last update, we shrunk the segment number space to 16 bits because we were not needing 32, and then I tried to bring more clarity on boxes that would rely on IP fragmentation instead of supporting the segmentation option. I will simplify this even more and basically do like the IP fix and say we should not do fragmentation. I was just wanting to try and not allow this. So say you can do this, but not by default. Based on what we discovered last week during the hackathon, etc., I would like to change this and simply say you should not do fragmentation. Then I received a bunch of comments on the relationship between the last bit flag of this option and the sequence number, mostly by Andy. I agree with all of them, and the request for clarification will be done. So you were asking for details, and I agree with you. It wasn't clear on some parts, and the changes you were asking, I agree with all of them. So you will find them in -02. Next slide, please. Next. You can go to next slide, Mahesh. Okay, so the current implementation status is, so during the hackathon, we were working in an environment where within Swisscom Lab, we had a Huawei implementation of this version. So we were following -0.1. Based on the feedback that I will receive, I will update to the comment. And on the collector side, we have a Golang version of the collector and a C version of the collector. The C version is being validated and integrated within PMHGT right now. For our next steps, we will probably provide DDLS support for this. It's not our top priority because in all the deployment scenarios, we won't need it. And then I will apply the changes that you guys recommend based on the discussions on the mailing list that we will have based on this meeting. Thanks.
All right. Any questions? I don't see anyone in the queue. And anyway, we are
Awesome.
Well, Rob was in the queue before, and while I'm doing slide transitions, maybe he can come back and if he still has something to say.
Okay, go ahead, Rob.
Yes, it's actually on the previous issue. If we still have time, I'm not sure whether we need to discuss it further now. I think it needs further discussion on the list, and a potential get resolved during working group last call. I think the question was really about whether the ISG would accept a protocol where this is unspecified, and the answer is I don't know. I think it will just depend on the AD reviews at the time, or the ISG reviews when that happens. From my point of view, I don't think it makes sense to make this overly complicated. That as long as we can communicate the intent sufficiently enough, that's probably good enough. But I need to look at the issue a bit more closely again to actually give a definitive answer. Does that help?
So, yes, that helps a lot. So what I would suggest is I remove the S-bit and I reserve the last few values on them so that I don't need any reference to anything, and we proceed this way, and so that I follow in this comment that this stuff is too complicated for no reason. Do I do that in -0.2?
So just to understand, are you saying that you wouldn't then have a GPB encoding with you would?
I would not, but I would reserve values in the. I would not create a private space, but I would just reserve values, and so that the header will no longer change. And if based on the review we can leave a reference to a value being GPB, then we just leave it there, and that will just be a value being fixed. Okay. And if they say GPB won't work because it's not standard, then I leave it in the reserved space. That is the usual blurry space that we define at the IETF for this reason. So I don't overcomplicate stuff with this S-bit. I leave room for GPB in the standard space. If we get review further down the IESG review that says, but GPB is not a standard, you cannot put it there, then I will leave GPB being used in the reserved space that I would define.
So I don't think it matters whether GPB is a standard. I don't think that will necessarily be a problem from that perspective. I think it's just a matter of whether the specification is clear or not in terms of what it's used. And it may be that effectively, if these are reserved, you can have some inner space that actually defines what these fields are for the ones that aren't in the document, and hence that can be extended with future documents that specify this behavior if required.
Excellent. Okay, cool. So we will do that. I like this.
Okay. So the next presentation is actually draft IETF-NETCONF, distributed node of not Unite. It's a adopted draft.
Exactly. I'm sorry for that. So next slide, please. So in compared to 00, these are the changes we made in the draft, mainly in two areas, in the terminologies and motivation part. In the terminologies, we are basically borrowing the terms from RFC 7011, so IPFix export in section 2 and 3.1, basically using the terms observation domain and observation domain ID, and consequently replacing the term generator ID with observation domain ID in the drafts, distributed notif, UDP notif, and notification messages. In the motivation section, as requested from the working group mailing list, we were specifying the reasoning for observation domain ID, mainly on the data integrity side, to preserve it across multiple publisher export processes. The same also for being able to recognize lost and corrupt young notification messages across multiple export publisher processes. Next slide, please. So the questions from the mailing list which has not been resolved yet are listed here, mainly from Andy and Mahesh. Thank you very much. So one question was in regards whether we should map observation domain ID exactly down to the processor publisher export process by mapping to IETF hardware, IANA hardware young models. By looking up IANA hardware young models, the closest match I saw was CPU, but it's unclear what CPU actually means, if it's actually also matching the term network processors as well. And here I like to get more feedback from the working group and also from the authors of IETF hardware, IANA hardware, whether this is really the right place to augment to, because if we want to map to the export process or just to the network processor, to the CPU only. So that's one question. The second one is in regards to the observation domain ID, if it's needed in the UDP notif header, and I think Pierre already answered that question in his previous presentation, and I just want to re-emphasize here that basically on the data collection side, if the observation domain ID would not be within the UDP notif header, basically we, in order to enable data integrity, we would need to look into the notification message itself, and I think that would be a cross-layer violation, which we would like to avoid. Yeah, looking forward for feedback from the group. That's all. Any questions?
Rob.
So this is a comment as an individual, and I have to say I've not read the specifics here, but I think I would probably regard a CPU and NPUs generally being different in most cases. Often, sometimes they could be the same, but it might be useful to have a separate term to differentiate them. The only other question I have, and again, I might be completely off mark here, is if it's the observation domain IDs are tied to what that is, obviously some line cards may have multiple separate NPUs. So I don't know if that's something that needs to be considered or not, or whether that is not an issue.
Exactly. So as you nicely pointed out, it's not only about the naming, it's then also about being able to model it down to chassis, line cards, NPUs, and down that road. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I'll put myself in the queue and ask. If I understand, I think Andy's question was, how would you identify, and I don't want to speak for him, he can certainly speak also, but how do you identify a line card that has either been unplugged and put back in, versus it's been replaced by another line card with exactly the same type? How would you be able to distinguish between those two line cards?
Right. That's only possible if you start to model observation domain ID in a Yang model, and currently neither IETF hardware nor IANA hardware is supporting this. That's why I'm asking for feedback from the working group and the authors, how you intend or what you think is the best way to model this. Because once we have a feedback on this, we can help here to extend, augment the Yang model, and then basically merge the observation domain ID in there. The moment it's not existing.
So would you say then that you have a problem today, irrespective of whether IETF hardware is the right Yang model, that you need a way to uniquely identify a line card?
Exactly. If that is the intent, if that is what we are aiming for, then absolutely, yeah. For instance, in IPFix, they did not resolve that problem. So there, the IDs were generated, and you could not map it down to the line card to the network processors, and it was already sufficient to ensure data integrity. So for the data collection, it's not needed to map down to the specific network processor, but it in order to troubleshoot further, it certainly helps. And I'm not against it. I'm fully supporting that idea.
Okay. Right, any other questions? If not, we are ready to move to, I guess, the non-chartered items. And Ping, are you there? Can you queue up? All right. You're good to go, Ping.
Okay. Hello, this is Peng Liu from China Mobile, and it's about the telemetry data export capability. So next slide, please. Okay, let's have a recap first. The motivation is that the notification mode divided in NETCONF notification capabilities allows a client to discover a set of capabilities, such as transport independent session level, and support by the server. But some transport-specific parameters are lacked, just like the transport protocol encoding format and encryption. So the goals of the work is to augment system capabilities model and provide additional data export attributes for transport independent capability negotiation. Yeah. So next slide, please. Okay, this draft was first presented in the last IETF meeting, and it was suggested to set up design team to process this work. And the latest update of the draft is version 2. And the changes are 3 points. First is we remove the max node per sensor group and max sensor group per update in YAM model, because there are maybe some vendors don't need to have these characters. And we also remove the subscription mode, and because we think that we can add some specific functions or parameters, and we don't use this subscription mode, and it can be more simple and simple, yeah. And the third one is we add adaptive interval support and remove sampling interval list definition. to support the adaptive interval collection, which will be introduced later. Yes. Okay, next slide, please.
Ping, you're a little bit quiet on the microphone. If you're able to improve that, that'd be good.
Okay. Okay, this is overview of the data export capability model. The server, it shows that the server notifies the telemetry data export capability to the data collector, and which could be the network management system. It notifies the transport protocol encoding format and security protocol. Yeah, then the NMS can subscript the YARN notification according to its demand. For example, it needs the UDP protocol binary encoding format and TLS security protocol. Then the server will send the notification over UDP and also satisfy others parameters or functions. It just shows the protocol that needed. In fact, the server will notify all the capability to the network management system. Yeah, and here are two pictures shows the version. Okay, maybe I guess it's not the latest version. It's no problem. Yeah. Next page, please. Okay, here are some issues which are discussed in the mailing list, I think, and both of the three questions are solved. The first question is the server can provide hints based on the exact request from the client. So we just reply that the answer is one of the principles set by RFC YARN push is to minimize the number of subscription iterations between subscriber and the publisher, and discourage random guessing of different parameters by a subscriber. And our idea is to try to prevent the problem at the stage of negotiation of subscription in order to minimize the number of iterations. Yeah, so we want to just maybe it can improve the efficiency and increase the loss rate. Yeah, and the second question is about the static per node monitoring data can be quite large. So we just discussed about it, and we think the subscriber applications need a way to identify capabilities for some data store node object. And in fact, we can't assume that all data objects defined in the YARN model support threshold handling. Maybe just some of them support these functions, and so it won't generate so many data. Yeah, and the third question is sensor group seems a very vendor-specific capability. So we remove the two parameters. One is max node per sensor group and max sensor group per update, and we have taken them out in the latest version. Yeah, these three questions are the three main questions discussed in the mailing list. So I think all of them are solved now. Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. So it's about the data export capability, and can we call adoption of it as a work item? And any comments?
So this is kind of as co-chair. This is one of the documents that we did the adoption suitability poll for before.
Yeah.
And well, and there was an objection that was raised, I think, by Andy. I just want to be, was that covered? How did that objection get resolved?
Okay, so sorry, I just missed some of the voice.
Sorry, I didn't understand the response. Can you say that again?
Okay.
Ask the question on Ken's behalf. What he's asking is, did we resolve the objection that was raised during the adoption poll of the draft?
Okay, I think, Jane, can you answer this question?
Right. Chen, why don't you go next? Chen, do you want to step up to the mic to answer the question? Okay, you
Okay.
go ahead.
Jane, can
Chen.
Hello?
Yeah, Chen.
Okay, this is Qing. Actually, yeah, as Peng Liu actually clarified, we discussed the issue. We list in the last slides. Actually, all the issue has already resolved in the latest version. Yeah. So all the change we made actually has already incorporated in the version 02.
Okay, so go ahead, Ken.
Okay.
My comments on something else, so I'll let Andy go first on this. Actually, I've got a comment about the structure of the draft or content of the draft.
All right, go ahead, Andy.
Well, I just don't think all this extra complexity is needed, and that the RPCs already have extensive mechanisms to provide these hints, and ignoring that and doing something else isn't that high a priority.
Yeah, Andy, actually, we clarify your issue actually in the first bullet. Actually, I think we did send an updated slide. Actually, we could use RPC and use the error option to show what's wrong actually. But if we define this capability in advertisement, actually we can avoid unnecessary negotiation. So that's the way we reference some of text in Yang push actually. It also highlight that we should avoid unnecessary subscription exchange iteration. So
yeah,
this is how we address your comments. Yeah.
I don't see where that's happening, because either I send one request and I get back the hints, or I send the request your way and I get back the capabilities. Either way, it's one request, one response. I don't see all the extra work iterations that you're talking about.
Yeah, well, our idea is in the first step, we, to just advertise the capability to the server, so server can to choose, for example, choose what transport protocol it will use in the Yang push subscription message. So you don't need to have this RPC to.
Yeah, can I suggest that you take this discussion? We're running a little behind, and we still have Rob in the queue. So can you take the discussion of iterations and RPCs to the queue, please? The mailing list.
We can take it to the list. Yeah, sure.
Rob?
So just one quick comment on that is, I think what this draft is providing is to allow the capabilities to be expressed up front, as in maybe in an instance data document. So a client could be coded at design time to know what the capabilities of the server is like to be. So that's one comment on that. But the other question I had was, in terms of the structure of the Yang, it looked like you could just define for example, one transport that's supported or one encoding, whereas I'd have thought that servers have different capabilities that they support, and hence it may be that the structure of the model needs to be more flexible, or otherwise I don't understand in the Yang why it's only expressing one of those rather than this is the set of different transports or encodings that are supported.
Yeah,
Okay,
I think we can allow the server to advertise the capability, for example, support different transport protocol, but we can make a client to make a choice which transport protocol or encoding they can support.
Okay, we really need to move on to the next presentation. I think, Chin, you're up next.
Yeah, can you open slides?
Yeah, we're coming up.
Do a few seconds. There's like 5 confirmation windows you have to click through in order to get to them. So go ahead.
Okay. So this is Qing. I'm here to discuss adaptive subscription to Young notification draft update. And next. So current status of this draft has been presented in previous 2 IETF meeting, and actually we tried in a previous IETF meeting, it was suggested to align with ECA model, and also we actually introduced a new subscription mode besides the periodic subscription and unchanged subscription, and so we need to better characterize this subscription. So in last IETF meeting, we also discussed this, and we got actually a lot of support. And so in latest version, actually we try to remove the dependency to the ECA model. We remove the data path target definition, and we also clarify the XPath external evaluation node in the Young model, and rewrite the usage example to align with these Young model parameter changes. Next. So for people who don't know what the adaptive subscription is, actually, it is the extension to the subscript notification. For Young push subscription, they support 2 different modes. One is periodic subscription, which allow you to publish the data periodically, and another is unchanged subscription, which allow you to publish data when data get changed or protocol operation on data get changed. But in some cases, maybe for server and client, they may support multiple period intervals. So the server may need to switch different interval according to the network condition or research usage. The typical example is the wireless performance monitoring. The wireless signal strength can be weak, can be strong. So because of the air interface resources is very expensive, so we can when the wireless signal strength is very strong, we actually can collect the data at a lower rate. But when the signal strength is very weak, actually we can collect more data, since we need to have sufficient enough data to do the troubleshooting. So this can greatly reduce the data to export to the client. So so we introduce this subscription, adaptive subscription, and enable this subscription to the publish event, and so they can adjust the volume, the telemetry traffic. Next. So this is what the model structure look like. Actually, we augment the subscriber notification. We propose a set of parameter, for example, periodic, anchor time, and this will specify new duration for push update, and this period will be triggered when condition get changed, and the anchor time will specify the starting point for each update interval, the starting time update interval, And also we introduced water marker and XPath external evaluation. This actually can provide the evaluation creation, and the watermark actually is part of this evaluation expression, and can use to express the condition to be satisfied, and trigger the interval switching. So here we just give an example. So when such condition expressed by the XPath external evaluation actually get changed. Actually, the condition get actually satisfied. Actually, it will send the adaptive periodic update notification immediately, and so the client can adjust the telemetry connection rate accordingly. Next. Here is the issue we actually raised by the Andy on the list, and about a filter. It's this filter and trigger maybe not in good design. So we make some change actually accordingly. For example, we take out the data path target, and things that we don't think this is something needed, because this actually will impact or influence the event record output actually. So in this model, we also change the naming. For example, we change the condition expression to the XPath external expression. This XPath external expression will keep track of data object change, but this expression will not, affect the event record output, and the only can use to trigger the interval switching in the server. That's the main change we made. Actually, try to simplify this model and decouple from the ECA model, since we think these different use cases doesn't need to be tied with ECA use cases. And next.
The main change, and also it was the one that the reason why the adoption poll did not succeed. I don't recall it being discussed in the list, but maybe Andy, since it was your objection, if you've had a chance to take a look at this, can you speak to it as to whether or not it resolves your issue? Go ahead, Andy.
I haven't read the latest draft and don't really have any objections. It's not really our focus right now with Yang Push. We've actually spent a lot of work implementing Yang Push and decided that the periodic stuff isn't that great. So on change is what you want to use, and it's just much more efficient than trying to adjust the period on the fly. It's more work to do on change, but it's better. So
yeah, thanks, Andy.
So as a contributor, Andy, I'm kind of curious about that comment that you just made, because I think the reason for the periodic was because there's some values that just don't change very often at all, maybe once a day or even less often. But because they're periodically pushed in case the subscriber comes in later, they get it, the value. But I guess there's also a sync up that occurs, right? So when the subscriber first, there's a sync up, so they get all the values up front, and then I guess it's just changed from that point forward. Okay, maybe I do understand. I'm answering my own question.
Yeah, and you can request a resync on the fly too, if you missed that, or lost it.
Okay, thank you. Robert, you're in the queue.
So just a comment as an individual. So I just again wonder whether this is quite a complex solution to the problem, and whether a simpler solution might just be to mark some subscriptions as being effectively higher priority data and others as lower priority, and then to have one setting to say allow this to be adaptive in some way, and then just leave it to the device to try and reduce the rate that it's sending this information out if necessary, without specifying specific periods or paths or that sort of thing. So have it as a more coarse level type of QoS rather than having to specify specific conditions and things like that. So you put more intelligence into the device, you're relying on it to do sensible things rather than giving you very specific instructions as to how to manage this data. But it's just as an individual comment.
Robert, I'm not sure, for your proposal, it seems you need to satisfy actually to lose some of the data since you prioritize some of the data. But for our cases, whether you use the high data connection rate or lower data connection rate, you will not lose any data.
Thomas,
Can you
you're in the
make
queue?
Yeah. Go ahead, Thomas.
I just wanted to follow up on Robert's comment. I was thinking the same. So I think ideally, if for a periodical subscription, we could have a range, say from 1 to 10, and then basically the publisher decides, depending on the state, which value it's choosing for the export interval.
Yeah, the assumption we made is you can support a multiple update interval, but a server, they may have the capability to switch this interval to reduce the volume of the data to be exported to the client too. So you can address this performance bottleneck. So yeah, that's what we proposed. Yeah.
Okay, I think we are running behind, so maybe take it to the mailing list again. All right, next. So Chin, I would suggest that take the discussion to the mailing list, including the question of adoption. Let's try to resolve on the mailing list, please.
Okay, thank you.
All right, next we have Yan.
Very good.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Very good. So next slide, please. And next. So now that we have NetConf being spread around and managers are actually starting to use this a lot, one of the use cases I see very often is that the manager wants to keep in sync with the configuration changes on a large set of devices. So you often see that, okay, it's doing a get config initially to see what the configuration on that device is and gets a reply. And then after some time, longer or shorter, it's interested to make a change. And before it makes a change, it likes to see, is this configuration still the same? It's issues another get config and eventually gets a reply and sees that, oh, yeah, it's the same. But this mechanism is quite wasteful because it's getting this get config reply, which is oftentimes exactly the same as the get config reply earlier, and it is pretty large in many cases. So if there was a shorter and easier way to get to know if this configuration is the same or not, that would be very convenient. I have seen actually several vendors have implemented their own proprietary mechanisms for providing a shorter way to convey this information, like a timestamp of last change or some checksum of the config or something that you can read in order to see if anything has changed at all in the device. But those mechanisms, we are using them and they are kind of nice. They're better than nothing, but they are not quite good enough because in many cases there have been small changes somewhere, but maybe not in the area where this particular client is interested to see, oh, has it changed? So it will be reported as changed, but it hasn't changed in anything, in any area that this client is caring about. So we are back to square one, essentially. If you go to the next slide. This mechanism also has the problem that it often gives, or sometimes gives false alarms, or you miss it false. You say that you notice that, oh, I issue a get config, and you get a get config reply. You spend a lot of CPU time to compute, is this the same as last time? Yeah, and it is. But in the meantime, there's a window of opportunity for another client to come in and make a change. So we think it is still the same, but actually it has changed since somebody got in the middle. So then we get into the case where we are updating the server in an unsynchronized manner, even though we've checked. So I'm proposing a mechanism to get away from both of these problems, make it more efficient and make it more reliable. Next, please.
Contributor, I think with NetConf, it's traditional for lock followed by get config followed by edit config. So you're ensured that you're only editing the data that you had gotten inside the lock. Can you speak to that?
That would take a long time then, because getting the config and computing if there's a change can take several minutes. So then you would have to lock for a long time. And I think that's not what we see happening in real networks.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I'm proposing a solution where we say that we have a concept of a transaction ID attribute that the server may report for every container and list elements. We don't want to have this on every leaf and everywhere, but on containers and list elements. And we make sure that whenever there's an edit config, the server will update the transaction ID value for every container and list element that has been touched by this transaction, so that the client can rely on this transaction ID being something new if it has changed, if something inside it has changed. And the client may optionally specify a transaction ID value that they would like the server to use. So anything that is touched by this client, or so it can, in an edit config, the client can specify this transaction ID, and then the server will apply that transaction ID value to everything that has been touched. But also the client, during a get config, can specify transaction IDs of what it expects, to say, oh, I believe the contents of this container or this list element has this transaction ID. And if it matches, there's no need for the server to send the content of that. And on the next slide, please, I have an example of what that looks like. So here we have an initial sync where the client is issuing a get config, and with a filter for interfaces and NACM. And on the interfaces, it says, hey, can I have the transaction IDs for this, please, by issuing this in tag equals question mark. Next, please. And this is what the reply might look like. So here the server has decorated the reply with these transaction and tag values. And you can see this def something on various containers on the, well, you have on the top level here data, which is for the entire data store, saying that the global transaction ID for the data store is def888. Whereas for interfaces, the whole set of interfaces container, it's def888. And for a particular interface here, gigabit Ethernet 00, it's def888. But another interface, gigabit Ethernet 01, has an older end tag called ABC123. So this is how the server would decorate the replies with these tags for the areas of the response where it was requested by the client earlier in the filter. Next, please. And then later, the client can say, okay, I do a get config here on interfaces with this end tag value ABC123, which is what I expect to be here. And next, please. This is how a server would reply, and it would say, Yeah, it has actually been some changes in interfaces. So the global transaction ID is now def888. Interface is also def888. This gigabit Ethernet 00 has also changed its def888, and here's the one which had I think that was all my slides, basically. Let's take the next one. Yeah, okay, right. So in a edit config, we could, the client could also say, hey, I expect the transaction ID of this interface to be GHI5555. So if it is, go ahead and run this transaction and delete this interface in this case. But if it isn't, if one of these transaction IDs have a mismatch, then abort the whole transaction and report it. Things are not the way that you expected. Things have moved since you last synchronized. So then the transaction is aborted. So that's a safe way of performing this edit. I think there was one more slide with just some.
See Tim Terry, thank you. Tim, do you have a question or comment? Go ahead.
I have a question, and it's really maybe can you address the issue of the race condition where you set a transaction ID of foo, and by the time you come back with the get config, elements that you have changed have been changed either by the system or through some other client. Is that the intention? How do you handle the fact that your data set of what you thought you changed got changed between the time you changed it and you issued the get?
Yeah, this is exactly the mechanism to handle that problem. So by the client proposing transaction ID when it's making an edit config, or by this, and certainly by the server guaranteeing that whenever something changes, a new transaction ID has to come on to the touched containers and list elements. That's how a client can be sure that only it can read updates only by using get config with these transaction IDs, and it can edit config safely by adding this transaction ID for what it expects, and only if all the tags that is mentioned in the edit config are matching, only then will the transaction go through. So that's a safety lock there.
Yeah, but I as a client won't know. I don't have any assurance that what I have changed under this transaction ID is indeed what is still changed when I do like a get config right after I make my changes, or I wait 3 seconds or 3 minutes, right? I mean, is that expected, or is that a hole in the concept, right?
No, but
where, because you don't have any with lock, everything's atomic, right? Everything's there and it's atomic. With this is kind of, it's not safe in terms of the transactional set, right? That that this is what's changed, and what has changed, which elements, which leaves have changed, right?
it is absolutely atomic. If any tags do not match, now the transaction is aborted entirely. I'm not giving up on transactionality.
Oh, you're saying like on the delete and I was talking about just the original change with the get. I'm sorry, I was back on the previous slide when I entered the queue. So I come in, I do an edit config, right? I'm not doing a delete operation yet, right? I'm just trying to figure out what changed, right? So I do an edit config, I say tag foo, right? And then I say, okay, get config, and I want to understand which nodes were changed to foo, right? Based upon foo. But in between then, some other client can come in and make a change, right? And so it loses that tag. And so I never really understand, there's opportunity, or there's chances there that I will never really understand what actually changed, right? Particularly if it's a quick changing set of nodes. or frequently changing set of nodes. I just, is that accurate? I'm just trying to make sure I understand if that's a problem.
Right. I may not understand your intent exactly here. So, I mean, if you're interested in knowing the exact state of the device, you're welcome to either do a get config of everything and or to do a subscription of some sort. You can do that in order to follow everything. But what this is about is to ensure that when a client has a view of the state of the server, it should be able to verify that view quickly by saying, okay, I know this about the configuration, and these are the tags I'm aware of, and just report the differences versus what I know. So that's the mechanism I'm looking for here.
Okay, that's so now I kind of understand it. You're just saying, hey, look, I made this modification, and then I want to go back and do some editing, but only if I'm the last one that changed it, right? Okay. All right. Now
yes, or yes, yes, and also the case that, okay, there may be changes, and if there are, let me know what those changes are versus what I know. So don't report everything everywhere. If things are as I expect them to be, then don't report them.
Okay, sorry guys. I know I'm in the queue and Balaz is after me, but we are really out of time on this. So sorry, Balaz, can you take your question to the mailing list?
Actually, Mahesh, I'll give some time to Balaz. Okay. It's okay.
All right, then maybe.
My presentation is after this one for other people who are wondering where that's coming from. Go ahead, okay. Bosch. What's your question?
My point is that we have something very similar in REST-conf, and it would be good to understand that, is this the same mechanism actually, or are we, if we have a data store that is visible both on REST-conf and NetConf, then do we have to support to similar but not the same mechanism? So describe somehow the relationship with REST-conf e-tags.
Yes, this was definitely greatly inspired by the e-tags, and my intention is that the server implementation should be able to be joined here. But things are still early in this draft, and we will see where it takes it. I don't want to guarantee that it will be exactly the same or very much compatible with e-tags. But yes, it is the same mechanism that we have in e-tags already that I'm trying to describe here.
All right, I know I'm the queue, so if it's okay, can I take one more minute? I'll take that as a yes. Yeah, I understand the optimization in terms of trying to tag at least at the container and the list node, but couldn't this be a little more coarse-grained for you to say for a given config or a transaction, you have a tag, and if you're trying to edit it and if the tag doesn't match, you request that you do it. You request the client make another get config request before moving to try to make any edit changes. Meaning, you don't have to necessarily carry tag at every container and list level. You could carry it at the transaction level.
Yes, it's up to the client to decide what part of the transaction it really cares about things being the same. It can say, for this part of the tree, I'll just go ahead as traditional edit config. But for the interfaces list, I'm really interested to make sure that all the interfaces I touch are untouched, or that no interfaces have been touched, or a particular aspects of details of one interface are important. So it's up to the client to decide where the tags have to match.
Okay.
So as chair, Mahesh, can you go ahead and bring up the last presentation? But as a contributor to Jan, I would recommend trying to align this work exactly with REST-conf if possible, because I know that some servers that present both REST-conf and NetConf actually build one of those interfaces on top of the other. And I think typically REST-conf is built on top of NetConf, but anyway, I guess the question is why couldn't it be aligned? Why wouldn't it be aligned? What was the reasoning for not being aligned? I think I'm taking it to the list, but please try to address that comment later.
Certainly.
All right, Mahesh, can you go full screen, please? Okay, so this is the last presentation. As everyone probably saw on the list, there was some interest in introducing support for list pagination in both the NetConf and the RESTconf protocols. I sent out a call for participation and did get some responses. Thank you, Jin, Olaf, and Hongwei. There are actually also other respondents, but they haven't yet contributed, and so they're not yet listed here, but hopefully that will improve next presentation. Next slide, please. The motivation for this work is to, first and foremost, to better support user-facing client interfaces interacting with data from potentially large lists. Examples of potentially large lists include traffic logs, or really any time series data, which might include audit log, but in general, those time is kind of like config false op state type data. But also within configuration, there are some very large lists. Sometimes interfaces or firewall rule bases can grow to be in the thousands. And of course, it's all very manageable today with existing, and NetConf. I mean, already it's the client gets the entirety of the large configured list and then handles it itself in its own memory. But if we are already solving the problem for the extremely large, potentially op-state lists, also, transferring that to the config true lists would be of some benefit. And then lastly, server-side processing in general reduces latency and bandwidth and client resources. So that's the motivation behind this work. Next slide, please. The solution, okay, I'm just looking at the graphics. No, it's not like the bottom line is all crossed out. It's supposed to be filter goes to sort goes to direction, etc. You can see the little arrows, but it's not looking quite right. Anyway, let me go back up to the top of the slide. The solution proposal is to introduce to both NetConf and RESTconf an API for list pagination. There's 5 control points that have been discussed, and this was on the list, so I'm a bit repeating, but since this is the first presentation introducing the work, I wanted to make sure there's a slide for it. There's the ability to limit the number of results that are returned in the response. There's the ability to control the point at which the result set begins. Maybe you don't want to always start at the very beginning of the list. You might want to begin somewhere in the middle. There's the direction that the results are returned. Are they returned in the forward or reverse direction? And potentially there's an ability to sort the results, maybe on a particular node or in SQL terms on a column, sort on a particular column, and then the results would be in that order. Or if it's an ordered by user list, by default, the order is the configured order, as it were, by the order by user list. And then lastly, there's potentially the ability to filter the items. Maybe the client is only interested in zooming into a particular subset of the data. Now these control points are actually ordered in processing. There's a processing order. It is in fact the reverse order. So first the results are filtered. Filters in general are very fast. They're almost always, hopefully the node or the leaf that you're filtering on has been indexed by your backend database. So it's a pretty fast operation to do the filter. And then if there is a need to do sorts, that would happen after the filter. So you're only sorting the subset of the data that has gotten through the filter, if there was a filter. Then lastly, the direction, and then you can choose whether or not you're going to skip or do an offset into that result set, and then lastly, figure out what subset of the data or how many number of the results that you're going to return. So that is the processing order. And for those that are familiar with SQL, that is exactly what SQL does. And I imagine it is the same for most backend databases, but that is in fact what this author list is doing. So there's a number of authors that are, or some authors are more implementation oriented, and so we have a representation of different backend databases, and we're doing prototypes of all this to ensure that it's mappable to the various backend databases. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is mostly discussion, so I have questions to the group. There's some protocol independent questions, and the first three are actually related, so I'm going to say them all, but then sort of go back and ask for comments on each one at a time. So first, how important is it to iterate over stable result sets? I think it was Jan who had posted a comment about this to the list, but essentially should something like cursors or snapshots be supported? And just sort of thinking out loud, I'm for configuration with RESTConf at least, and in the last presentation, the equivalent of an E tag or timestamps, is that good enough in the sense that if you're doing a get on data, and you're saying, okay, I know the E tag is supposed to this, or I know the timestamp is supposed to be this, and if you're indexing or paging into the data set, but now the data set's been changed under the hood, wouldn't it be good enough to just for the client to get back an error saying, hey, the data set's changed, you need to restart your pagination, or is that not good enough, and we actually need to create something like a cursor or a snapshot? So that's for my thinking out loud for configuration, and then thinking out loud for op state. Again, I'm assuming we're talking about read-only time series data like audit log or traffic logs, and I'm guessing it's stable enough. It's read-only. I mean, sure, logs can expire, given how much resources, memory, or storage the server has on board. But you can imagine logs sticking around for at least a few hours or days or whatever, and I mean the client may not get the most recent set of logs, but you could imagine the pagination logic always having in it a filter criteria saying that the timestamp has to be, cannot be greater than whenever the pagination began. So all the logs that came in after the pagination began would be excluded, and hence effectively the remaining logs it is a stable data set, again, not including purging. Okay, so for number 2 and 3, I'm going to mention these quickly and then go back to 1. For 2, I'm wondering if offset or skip, I mean, we're trying to figure out what the name should be. Is it offset or skip? Then that's actually the comment for number 3. But it is the offset/skip parameter. Should it be an integral amount, like an integer value, which would be consistent with SQL's SQL's offset parameter, or should it be a key-based lookup? So you begin your pagination, and then somehow the last entry of the result set you got back, it contains a keyed value, and then your subsequent request for the next page of data is actually by page, or by key. You're asking for the next set of data beginning with a key, as opposed to the next set of data indexed by an integer. And then for number 3, and it really is the question of, it's a naming question. Should it be called skip, or should it be called count? I think in least SQL it's count, and likewise should be called offset or limit. I'm sorry, I think I have this backwards. It's skip or offset, count or limit. I don't have it. But anyway, the question is, how aligned to SQL names should we be? Of course, if going to number 2, if we're doing the key lookup, i.e. we're not going towards SQL or we're moving away from that approach, then the whole notion of whether or not we're aligned with SQL doesn't matter. So that's why, or how 3 is related to 2, and of course 2 is connected to 1. So going back to 1, and to the group, please, if anyone has any comments, how important is it to iterate over a stable set of results? We only have 5 minutes, so if there's any urgent comment, please raise your hand. Okay, I don't see anything coming. I'll take that to the list. For number 4, question is, should subsorts be supported? And currently the design as just presented on the previous screen was very much just a single sort, which is, by and large, 95% of what clients want, just a single sort. Your email client, right? You can only do a single filter at a time. That's very common, but it is noted that SQL supports subsorts. So for instance, you can do an order by foo ascending and then by bar descending, for instance. So there's this question as to whether or not subsorts should be supported. I do see Balazs in the queue. Please, Balazs, go ahead.
Early in Yang design, we avoided sorting because for some data types that's quite complex. Just as an idea that the O with the 2 dots, that letter, is in some alphabets behind the O, the simple O, some alphabets is behind the Z character. Are you going to address these complexities of sorting, or what do you want to do with them?
That's an interesting comment. I will take that to the list.
Martin had strong opinions on that, I don't know, a few years ago. Okay, so I think Martin has been involved some with this comment, with the discussion on the list previously. And I mean, in general, the thinking is that we should be using XPath query language for this, and so whatever that it supports would be by and large what we'd be doing. But I'll take this to the list. Do you have another question or comment, Balazs? Thanks. That's yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you're still in the queue.
I don't expect a full answer just now.
Okay. Good. Thank you. All right. So next slide, please, Mahesh. All right, so again, with the protocol independent, or continuing with that, how many drafts should there be? So this one I'm really hoping to get a response from right now. Should there be one draft, i.e. that contains 3 parts, the general definition, NetConf specifics, and then RESTConf specifics? So the pros of this is that it's a nice package, it brings it all together. The cons is that it's not a great RFC target for future work. Or there could be 2 drafts. One for each NetConf and RESTConf. Pros is that we've then decoupled, and now they make better RFC targets for future work. Of course, you can imagine, if a third protocol were to come along, it could then be its own draft, and so that's very nice. But the cons is that there's some redundancies between the 2. So, for instance, those 5 control points that we talked about before, they would have to be defined individually, each in those drafts. And likewise, the examples, you can imagine an example module, an example data set, an example data results that you would expect. I mean, of course, we do want to illustrate the query language in each of the protocol specific drafts, but we don't necessarily need to redefine the authoritative result set examples in each. And then or 3, option 3, is to have 3 drafts, which, again, would be one draft would be general definition, and then another for NetConf and a third for RESTConf. The pros is it's completely decoupled, much like the NMDA work. In fact, if we were to do this, we might consider moving that general definition draft to the netmod working group. The cons, there's more drafts. So any comments on this in the very few minutes that we have remaining? Blush, I see you're still in the queue. Do you mean to be, or did you just not exit the queue?
Didn't forget to exit.
It's the hand icon in the upper left corner. Okay, I don't see any comments. So Mahesh, there is just one more slide, and I know we're out of time, but I just quickly, can we do that? Next slide. So I have, so those are the protocol independent questions. I'll take them all to the list. For RESTConf specific, I do, and then there's another slide for NetConf, but there are no, I don't have any NetConf specific questions. So this is truly the last slide, if you will. The question is, what should the scope of the leaf and the leaf list targets be? And in particular, are we just doing the get method, which would be the minimally invasive type thing? Because after all, we're talking about list pagination, so it's just get that we're talking about. Or should we define leaf, I'm sorry, I said leaf, I meant list. List and leaf list, those two nodes as being targets for all HTTP methods. So not just get, but post, put, delete, patch, etc. All of them. So, of course, the considerations are, for increasing the scope would be it's more complete / pure, but I question there's actually little value. I mean, putting or posting or patching to the container is equally good. Never do you need to actually target the list itself. Of course, that's known, or it's shown but illustrated by the fact that we don't do it today. I think delete actually has a benefit. You could delete the entire list at one go, as opposed to, in case it hasn't been wrapped inside of a dedicated container. Instead of having to delete the entire container, you could delete the entire list that way. So delete has some benefit. But it is, like I mentioned, it's kind of out of scope. The focus of this work is to introduce list pagination, which would only be the get method. But while we're here, should we extend to support other methods? Any comments on that, or should I take it to the list? All right, I don't see any comments on that. I will take it to the list. And yeah, like I mentioned, there was another slide for RESTConf, but there was nothing there. I was just asking if anyone had any comments. And then there was just a thank you slide at the very end. That concludes everything for this meeting. So switching my hats, taking off my contributor hat, putting on my chair hat. Thank you everyone for joining. And Mahesh, do you have any comments? Closing comments?
No, I don't. Thank you. I know it's late for some folks.
Yes. Okay, very good. Thank you, everyone. And we'll virtually see you next time, or on the list before then. Okay. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
It's kind of funny. I'm looking for a way to end the meeting, but I don't think the option's there. It's just, we just exit, we just leave the room.